fall in Michigan once again. And so if your yards look like mine, they're beginning to fill with leaves. And I don't know about you, but this is actually my least favorite time of year in Michigan. We've lived here since 2016, and before that we lived several places. But when I came here, I don't think I had a full appreciation for the fall of southern Michigan. And that first year, I certainly wasn't equipped to deal with it. I just had a rake in my hand, and so I think I probably spent about 50 hours that first fall raking leaves in my yard. You can see the giant pile there that I had at one point. And so, I'm sure I developed calluses on my hands from all that raking. And the calluses I developed on my hands are, I think, similar to the calluses we can develop on our hearts. We develop calluses on our hands from this repetitive movement and the repeated pressure of our skin against the rake, but we develop calluses on our hearts from resisting God and His continuous pressure on our hearts. And there's my two kids up there. They do not have calluses on their hearts. They have hearts as soft as marshmallows. 100 bonus points if you see Jackie in the pile of leaves. Oh, there she is. So I think there are two different ways the Bible talks about the hardening of hearts. And we see Paul talking about one of the ways in Romans 2:5. He says, "But because of your hard and impenitent heart, you are storing up wrath for yourself on the day of wrath, when God's righteous judgment will be revealed." So this makes sense, right? We store up wrath for ourselves. I think everybody's sense of fairness would lead them to say that seems right and that seems fair. But the second one is in Exodus 10:1. Bryson read a little earlier. I'll read again. "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the hearts of his officials, so that I may perform these signs of mine among them.'" This is a little bit different, isn't it? This isn't us hardening our own hearts. This is God judiciously or divinely entering in and hardening our hearts. And this might strike us as a little bit unfair, particularly if we take this verse out of context. God speaks to us through the Bible and in stories, and Jesus spoke in parables. And I think He's meant to be understood that way. He did that for a reason. He didn't just write bullet points that could be broken down into theology very easily. We have to understand the whole context and understand the story if we want to understand this hardening. And so this hardening occurs in Exodus, but it's specifically in a part called the Plagues narrative. And it runs from Exodus 7 through 12. And previous to this, God has heard the cries of the Israelites. They're under their oppressors, the Egyptians, and they're being treated poorly. And so they cry out to God. He hears them, and He speaks to Moses through a burning bush. He tells Moses of his plan to release the Israelites from Egypt, from their oppressors. And Moses agrees to go, and he takes Aaron with him, who will be his mouthpiece. And they go to the elders of the Israelites there who are in captivity, and they tell them of God's plan. And the elders are excited, and the people worship. So Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh for the first time, and they make their first request to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh says, "Who is this Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." I don't know. I can't think of Pharaoh without picturing Yul Brynner. I don't know if anybody else is the same. I don't know. I just hear his voice in my head every time I read that. But so Pharaoh is this very arrogant guy, right? In fact, he regards himself as a god, as a man god, not only to the Egyptians, but to the Israelites as well. So he certainly can't honor this simple request, and the request is just to allow the Israelite people to go for 3 days in the desert to worship. So he can't allow that. That would be to acknowledge that there's a God above him, and he's an arrogant man. But God has a plan to humble him, and He says to Moses, "See, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron will be like your prophet." So there's tremendous irony in this. Here's this man, Pharaoh, who regards himself as God, but God is going to take Moses, a man of the race of slaves, and He's going to make him like God to Pharaoh and humble him this way. And so we see this pattern develop that occurs throughout the whole narrative whereby God gives Moses signs Moses takes those signs and performs them to Pharaoh. Pharaoh's heart is hardened, either by himself or by God. And then Pharaoh refuses to let the people go. There's 10 plagues in all. They're of generally increasing severity as we go along, culminating in the death of the firstborn. What I want to talk about is the first hardening of Pharaoh. And that occurs in the 6th plague, the plague of boils. So the first hardening, the first time that God divinely hardens Pharaoh's heart is in the 6th plague, Exodus 9, 10 through 12, and it reads, "So they took soot from the furnace and stood before Pharaoh. Moses tossed it in the air, and festering boils broke out on the people and animals. The magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils that were on them and all the Egyptians. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said to Moses." So this is interesting. And again, I think it can strike us as unfair if we don't understand the concept. It reminds me of sometimes I fight with Cameron, and I'll get on top of him, and I'll hold him down, and I'll grab his arms, and I'll hit himself in the head with his own arms, And I'll say, "Why are you hitting yourself, Cameron? Stop hitting yourself," right? This seems kind of like that, right? God's holding Pharaoh down, hardening his heart, and then asking him, "Hey, why are you hardening your heart, Pharaoh?" So it seems unfair if we don't understand the rest of the story. But I think when we do understand that story, we'll understand that this hardening of Pharaoh is actually just. In fact, it's a righteous judgment against Pharaoh. I think we'll understand that it's only temporary. It's meant to bring about a change in Pharaoh. It's meant to humble him. And finally, I think we'll understand that it's for a greater purpose, namely God's plan of salvation for Israel. So regarding the justice of God's hardening of Pharaoh, again, we first saw it in 9:12, the 6th plague. But previous to this, Pharaoh hardens his own heart, actually twice, explicitly, and probably several other times implicitly, but explicitly it says he hardens his own heart in the frogs, the 2nd plague, and during the flies, the plague of the flies, the 4th plague. And then after the 6th plague, during the plague of hail, once again. The plague of frogs, which coincidentally I think would be my kids' favorite plague. I think they'd be okay with that plague, up to the point where God kills all the frogs. They like frogs. Anyway, Exodus 8:13 through 15 reads, "And the Lord did what Moses asked. The frogs died in the houses, in the courtyards, and in the fields. They were piled into heaps, and the land reeked of them. But when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he hardened his heart and would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said." So Pharaoh asks for relief. He petitions God, and we have a God like none other, because not only is he powerful, but he's merciful. He brings plagues, but he takes them away when petitioned. So he does that. But as soon as he does, Pharaoh hardens his own heart. So we see time and again Pharaoh hardening his own heart. God has given him chances. The first request of Pharaoh was a simple request. "Hey, let us go. Let my people go into the desert for 3 days." But he won't do that. He won't do that because he's an arrogant man. And Exodus 9:17 says, "Still you are behaving haughtily to my people and not releasing them. Still you are behaving arrogantly," or some interpretations of that. So he will not humble himself. So at this point, the hardening, the judicial hardening, the divine hardening that God performs on Pharaoh is just. God could have destroyed Pharaoh at this point, and he would have been completely justified in doing so. And nobody would have had a problem with that because he deserved it. He had it coming. So this reminds me of a verse from Romans 1:20 that says, "For from the creation of the world his invisible attributes, both his eternal power and deity, are discerned clearly, being understood in the things created, so that they are without excuse." So I think we can say by the time the 6th plague rolls around, Pharaoh is certainly without excuse. He should have seen God's power and his deity at this point more clearly than just about anybody in the history of the world, right? So he is certainly without excuse. Exodus 5:21 says, so we can see that it's just the hardening of Pharaoh. But not only is it just, it's poetically just. It's poetically just. And if you recall, after the first petition to Pharaoh to release the people, what does Pharaoh do? Pharaoh turns around and he forces the Israelites to make bricks without straw, without reducing their quota. And so the elders come to Moses and Aaron and they say this in Exodus 5:21. And they said, "May the Lord look on you and judge you. You have made us obnoxious to Pharaoh and his officials and have put a sword in their hands to kill us." So what has Pharaoh done? Pharaoh has hardened the Israelites. So when God hardens Pharaoh, that's not just justice, that's poetic justice. Secondly, the hardening of Pharaoh is temporary. How do we know it's temporary? Well, the easiest way we can tell is that it must be repeated. If it was a permanent thing, God would only have to do it once, but he does it multiple times. He does it during the boils, the locusts, and then the darkness. But interestingly enough, in Exodus 9:34, which is after the first time God hardens Pharaoh, Pharaoh hardens his own heart once again. So we can see this synergy. When Pharaoh saw that the rain and hail and thunder had stopped, he sinned again. He and his officials hardened their hearts. So once again, he's hardening his own heart. God hasn't cut him off or determined for him to be destroyed or damned. He's giving him opportunities, and he's really trying to change his heart, make him humble and obedient. But he refuses. Pharaoh refuses. Finally, the hardening is for a greater purpose. As I mentioned, the one purpose would be to make Pharaoh humble and obedient. In Exodus 10:3, it says, "This is what the Lord, the God of Hebrews, says, how long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? Let my people go so that they may worship me." Another lesson is as we read in Exodus 10, 1 through 2, is that this lesson that is being taught through Pharaoh and through the Egyptians is something that's supposed to be passed on to generations. And it says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the hearts of his officials, that I may perform my signs among them, that you may tell your children and grandchildren how I dealt harshly with the Egyptians and how I performed my signs among them, and that you may know that I am the Lord." So the Israelites are to witness this, and they're to pass it on to generations, and they're to be assured that their God is the most powerful and merciful, and that he will protect them and take care of them as long as they, unlike Pharaoh, are humble and obedient servants. But not only they're to be assured, but I think they're to be warned. Right now, the Israelites are watching these plagues occur to the Egyptians, and they're from a protected position. They're like watching the movie, eating their popcorn. I wonder what he's going to do next, right? But they better take heed, because if they do the same thing that Pharaoh does, the same thing will befall them. And we know that ultimately it does. And Paul says in Romans 11:7, "What then? What the people of Israel sought earnestly, they did not obtain. The elect among them did, but the others were hardened. As it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that could not see, and ears that could not hear, to this very day." So we know that the same thing ultimately happens to Israel in the first century. But what of this hardening of Israel? Can we apply the same principles to it? Is it a righteous judgment of Israel? Is it temporary? And is it for a greater purpose? Not to spoil the ending, but perhaps for the salvation of the world instead of just Israel. Regarding the justice of the hardening of Israel, we read in Isaiah 65, 2 through 3, "All day long I have held out my hands to an obstinate people who walk in ways not good, pursuing their own imaginations. A people who continually provoke me to my very face, offer sacrifices in gardens, and burning incense on altars of bricks." And Jesus says in Matthew 23:37, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how often have I longed to gather you together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you are not willing." So here's Israel. God longs to gather them together, but they're not willing. Not only that, but they're obstinate, which seems like an understatement because they're killing and stoning prophets sent to them. So just like Pharaoh, they harden their own hearts long before God hardens their hearts, long before God cuts them off in their sin. John 5:46 says, "If you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me." So just as Pharaoh said, "I do not know this Lord that you speak of," the Israelites have become the same way. They don't know God, they don't know Moses, and they certainly don't know Jesus. The hardening of Israel is also temporary. Paul again says in 11:25 of Romans, "And if they do not persist in unbelief, they will be grafted in." He's speaking of the olive tree. "For God is able to graft them in again Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. In part, the part being those who persist in unbelief, and until being a certain period of time. So we know that it's temporary. Further, we know it's for a greater purpose. Paul again in Romans 11:11 says, "Again I ask you, did they stumble so as to fall beyond recovery? Not at all. Rather, because of their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make Israel envious. But if their transgression means riches for the world, their loss means riches for the Gentiles. How much greater riches will their inclusion bring?" So, through the transgression of Pharaoh, Israel is saved, and through the transgression of Israel, salvation comes to the world. So clearly God does have a greater purpose. So we can see that he's just in his hardening of both Pharaoh and Israel. And we can see that even with Israel, he longs to bring them in. He longs to graft them back in. But what he's seeking is a humble and obedient servant. And in the story of Exodus and the plagues narrative, you had God really dealing with three groups: Moses, Pharaoh, and the Israelites. In dealing with Moses, if you recall, Moses humbles himself, doesn't he? He removes his sandals before he approaches the burning bush. He humbles himself, and he's obedient. It takes a little bit of encouragement, but ultimately he's obedient. You had Pharaoh, who refuses to humble himself and refuses to obey, and ultimately he's destroyed. And you had the Israelites watching the show. They humble themselves and they obey. They paint their door frames with blood as commanded, and they are saved. So that's what God seeks, a humble and obedient servant. And I think that's what we can get out of this story. I still think that kind of sits not so well with some people. They think, well, isn't it a little bit arrogant? Isn't it a little bit arrogant of God to ask us to be humble and obedient? I don't know. And maybe it has something to do with this day and age, how, in the me generation, if you will. But recall who God is. And in Philippians 2:5-8, it says, "In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant. Being made in human likeness and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on the cross." I've heard people say that a good leader won't ask his followers to do something he's not willing to do. But you can see that we have the greatest leader. We have the greatest leader. He asks us to be humble and obedient, yet he is the most humble and the most obedient. And so we are to be imitators of him. And I'll read just one more verse here. Matthew 28:19-20 reads, and this is known as the Great Commission. "Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age." So he gives them a command, doesn't he? Make disciples, baptizing them. I wonder if the apostles had said, you know what, Jesus, I'm cool with all that except for the baptism part. I think what we're going to do instead is we're going to have people say like a believer's prayer instead. I wonder how that would have gone over with Jesus. I don't think so good. I wonder if when the Israelites had said, you want us to paint blood on the doorframe? I don't know, that sounds kind of literal to me. I'm going to paint blood on the doorframe of my heart instead. I wonder how well that would have gone over. I don't think so good. I don't think so good. So God commands that we are humble and we are obedient. And we can share in his sacrifice, his death, burial, and resurrection through the water's baptism. And if you haven't had that experience, and if you haven't joined his kingdom, will you please consider doing so today? Or if you need prayers or anything else, please come forward as we stand and sing.